If we just have the concept of the material world in general, who do you think are the most interesting people or companies to really try to understand?
What I found most interesting about kind of going into this world is that the vast majority of the companies I was encountering were not household names. So you think everyone's heard of Tesla, they've heard of Walmart, they've heard of Apple, but none of those companies really fully inhabit the material world. And what I mean by the material world is people who take stuff out of the ground and transform it into the physical products that we rely on, every day. And it doesn't have to just be literally the physical devices you've got, but it could be, the fiber optic cables that are allowing us to talk right now. People forget that this is an entirely material mode of communication when they are communicating online. It is everything is going through a fiber optic cable. Um, what I kind of encountered is there were just this enormous constellation of companies that I had never heard of who actually are doing the stuff that enable the household names to provide their products. Apple is a great example because they don't make a single thing. They design extraordinary devices. Um, but all of their devices are made by other people. And all of the components going into those devices are made by other people. And they just put the Apple name on at the end. It's a form of contract manufacturing, outsourcing. And it's been that way for a long time for Apple. They don't make the chips. And in fact, even TSMC who make the chips that go into the Apple devices, um, even they are not making the machines that make the chips. And even the people who are making the machines, so like take ASML. So you've got the silicon chip, which is the incredible transistor density is thanks in part to something called photolithography, this process of bouncing light, this extreme ultraviolet light, which doesn't exist in the real world we inhabit. It's a totally sci-fi thing they do, and we could kind of go down a long rabbit hole on that. But those machines, which are imprinting the incredibly small, like nanometer dimension transistors onto the chips. They're not made by TSMC, they're just operated by TSMC. They're made by another company called ASML. Now, more people have heard of TSMC these days than had previously. And actually, more people have heard of ASML than had done previously, partly because we had this semiconductor shortage recently, and a lot of people were paying more attention to this world. But then even ASML, their machine is made up of thousands of components made by other companies. So then you kind of go down another layer of complexity and you look at other companies like Trumpf, who make the lasers that go into those machines, or you look at Zeiss Semiconductor, the semiconductor wing, who make the lenses that go into it. And again, the further you dive into this world, the more you encounter, hang on, there are all these other companies who are the world's expert in, X or Y in the chemicals, for instance, a particular chemical that goes into that semiconductor foundry. And you realize that the companies that we've heard of are just sitting on top of this enormous sea of other companies who are kind of doing a lot of the real work, and that to me is amazing and inspiring. And that's before you even get to the fact that there is much more complexity further down that supply chain than you'd ever care to imagine. When we in the press talk about semiconductors, for the most part, people are just talking about what's happening in those chip foundries in Taiwan, where the transistors are getting kind of etched onto the silicon wafer. No one talks about where the silicon wafer comes from. But that's a whole other world of complexity and excitement and interest in and of itself. And when I started off writing this book, one of the things I wanted to do, like I say, I wanted to understand where things actually began. So I didn't want to, have it just explained to me that silicon chip, well, it just starts at a foundry. It doesn't start at a foundry. Where does the silicon start? Where does the silicon come out of the ground? And the people I spoke to within the semiconductor world, so the people who are making those chips, they didn't know. They didn't know where the silicon itself would come out of the ground. They'd never really thought about it because it's so distant to them. All they do is they order up a silicon wafer, a pure silicon wafer, and it arrives with them. Well, in order to create that silicon wafer, you need to go through process after process to take something that you mine out of the ground and turn it into something incredibly pure. It's an even more amazing journey than the one that goes on to make the chips themselves is making that silicon. And that was something that I'd never kind of, read about in a book before. And I thought, well, this is one of the most extraordinary journeys in the world. And all along that journey, you're encountering companies you've never heard of, and there are some of them mentioned in the book. Um, and I talked to actually Elchem was one of the companies I talked to who kind of do a lot of mining of quartzite, which actually for them typically more goes into silicones and stuff. But I found that was a world that was to me very unfamiliar and peopled by people who who are really expert in their field, who are not very publicity hungry. So a lot of these companies don't have a big, they don't talk about themselves all that much because they just do what they want to do. And also because for some of them, they're working in the world of manufacturing and energy intensive industry, and they're quite carbon intensive. And they know that it's not very popular to be a carbon emitter, even if you're emitting that carbon to do something which might help the energy transition further down the line. And this comes back to this other issue that we discussed when it comes to COVID. It's very difficult, these days within kind of mainstream press. Things are not necessarily covered in a way that is super rational a lot of the time. It's about denial or catastrophism. There's it's the end of the world, or why are we panicking? Nothing's going wrong at all here. And most of the people in this material world, in these companies, then they're not focused on that drama. They're just trying to kind of do their job, and a lot of the time, that job is taking us to a slightly better place. But I think they feel like every time they engage with the media, then they get caught up in that drama. And the book, I hope, doesn't fall into either of those two camps, and it hopefully kind of takes you into a rational way of looking at the world. There are enormous challenges in terms of getting the energy transition going, but trying to paint everything in terms of either denial or doom. It's denial or doom, which is the way a lot of it kind of ends up going. I don't think people respond to that all that much. And I don't think it's a fair reflection of the real world. So hopefully the book kind of answers that a little bit.